Good morning. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 5 in our textbook. But before we get to that, I wanted to do two things. One is, of course, to do what we normally do, which is to refer back to the last chapter, Chapter 4, and to think about some of the themes that were stressed in that chapter. Chapter 4 specifically dealt with the conditions, social, economic, demographic conditions of colonial America. But Chapter 4 also ended with perhaps one of the most important series of events that took place surrounding the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War began in 1754. It was a dispute between France and Great Britain over the Ohio River Valley. And it ended formally in 1763 by way of the Treaty of Paris. This created a complete victory for the British in North America, and it set the course for a whole new chain of events that would eventually play out in what we refer to as the Revolutionary Era. Basically, the approach of the British 3,000 miles that way in Europe will fundamentally change in the sense that their administration of the colonies will become much more controlling. And it will be the reaction to this change that will initiate a real revolutionary sentiment in the 13 colonies, and of course that will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War and the creation of the United States of America. Now, it just so happens that the other thing I wanted to call your attention to before we got into the details of Chapter 5 is that the end of Chapter 4 and the beginning of Chapter 5 actually represents Part 2 of the textbook that we're reading, Inventing America. And Part 2 is all about the idea of a new republic being born. Here we're referring specifically to the United States. And one of the things that the introduction to Part 2 stresses is that there were many things that the colonists cherished about their experience in being British, that there were many legacies of the British that the colonists felt very strongly about. In fact, one can almost say that the colonists believed themselves to be super British. They believed that they were the ones who really understood some of the liberties and rights that the British had developed over the past couple hundred years. And they believed that they had found their truest expression in the colonies of North America, in the 13 colonies, whether it be representative democracy or the protection of rights through the courts, or even just principled ideas like freedom of expression. The colonists came to believe that they were the ones that really represented the best of the British Empire. And so even when the break comes with Britain, the colonists will be adamant about retaining some of these ancient liberties that some will refer to them as, and making sure that they are enshrined in what will become the new republic. It's important, too, to realize that given the title of the book, Inventing America, that this preface to Part 2, this introduction, also speaks to the fact that America will eventually find a way to innovate in ways that will make their experience distinctly American. Indeed, it had been the case in the colonies that the colonists had sought to imitate much of the British examples when it came to civilization and the way that they lived their lives. But as the book rightly points out, no longer was America or American culture primarily imitative, as it had been before 1776. It had become innovative. And the idea is that taking British history as their foundation, the Americans found a way to build their own history and their own set of unique characteristics. And that's extremely important for where we're headed next, because we will see the evolution of this beginning in Chapter 5, but playing out as the new republic is born. So getting to Chapter 5, what's important to realize is that its scope includes not only the run-up to the Revolutionary War, but the Revolutionary War itself. And this is probably appropriate because it's important to see that, yes, while there are other paths that could have been taken, there was a certain momentum that gathered force as we moved through the Revolutionary period, as we moved away from the French and Indian War. And ultimately, it does seem that it became somewhat historically inevitable that the colonies would declare their independence. Now, that declaration of independence occurs rather late, and it occurs as kind of the very last thing that the colonists conclude that it is the best remedy for their problems. And let us keep in mind that not all colonists concluded this, that there were probably at least 1/3 loyalists in the colonies that were against independence, and probably about 1/3 patriot who believed in independence, and 1/3 in the middle that were kind of waiting to see how the situation would turn out. But ultimately, when we talk about the straw that breaks the camel's back, by the time we reach 1775, which will be the beginning of hostilities, and 1776, which will be the Declaration of Independence, we do have this kind of revolutionary sentiment that has a certain feeling of momentum to it. And so it's important to see that the Revolutionary period naturally gives way to the Revolutionary War, and that the conclusion of the Revolutionary War ultimately represents the conclusion of the Revolutionary era. So it's nice to see a real seamless transition there in this chapter. A lot of books would separate the drive to independence from the Revolutionary War into separate chapters, but it's actually a good thing that this book does the opposite. Starting Chapter 5, one of the great themes to keep in mind is that the colonists were very proud to be British. They felt this way because they thought they represented the best of the British Empire. As we will see, this view will change, and eventually we will see that the colonists will throw off what they consider to be their British oppressors and will embrace the idea that there should be a democratic republic, one in which their liberties would be safeguarded against any oppressive force. This was the idea that really would animate the Patriots by the time they got to 1775 and 1776. Well, how does all this trouble start? How do we go from being proud to being British to proud to being American? That's ultimately the question here. And a lot of it really comes down to the way that the British looked at the end of the French and Indian War. Remember, they had had their great rival France in the West. France had been vanquished. And to the American colonists, this presented the idea or the possibility for westward expansion. A great theme of American history is westward expansion. And the colonial era is no different, the idea that you could expand into these territories formerly held by France. Well, it would actually be the case that the British would want to halt westward expansion. They would do so with a proclamation in 1763 in which they would try and halt the expansion of the colonies at the Appalachian Mountains. And the idea was that this would prevent any uprisings with the Native Americans. There had been a pretty brutal uprising known as Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, right on the heels of the end of the French and Indian War. And the British were eager to avoid this, and so they felt like they had to hem in their colonists so as to prevent this kind of war footing from being developed with the Native Americans. There was also the concern over what the French and Indian War cost, and that will lead to an argument over taxes. So right off the bat, two things that are operating in the background will be the need for or the perceived need, I should say, for the British in Europe uh, to restrict the westward expansion of the colonists, and number two, the idea that they needed money to pay for the recently concluded war with France, to pay off those debts, and that will come through taxes. Now, the first way that the British tried to deal with the question of taxation was to basically take a bureaucracy that had been in force um, for at least 100 years and to make it more efficient, particularly the customs service. There had always been, since the middle of the 17th century, a series of navigation acts that were designed to basically control colonial trade. This fed into the idea of mercantilism that we spoke of earlier. But now, after the French and Indian War, now that the British could really kind of focus their attention on the administration of this bureaucracy, the idea was to improve it, to make it more efficient. And that's where you start to have some new ideas about how to raise revenues through this customs service bureaucracy. And so you get what is known as the Sugar Act, one of the first acts that will be implemented to raise revenue. It will be against the Sugar Act that the colonists will start to develop this idea that they have rights. Uh, they had always believed that they had rights, but now the rights are going to be shaped primarily as a form of resistance to the taxation. The colonists will employ this language of rights to argue that the taxes are illegitimate because they are lacking in consent. And we see this really take hold when it comes to the next great tax, which will be the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was unique in the sense that it was a direct tax, which meant that it was something that applied not just to imports and exports, as the Sugar Act had done, but instead applied to internal trade within the colonies themselves. This means that everything, all the commerce that was taking place in the colonies, which was quite extensive, had to be, you know, effectively taxed and stamped in order to take place. This, in addition to the introduction of admiralty courts, which were courts that did not have jurors, this struck many colonists as a real deprivation of their rights. And so you started to see this idea that there was a real air of illegitimacy to what the British were doing. And the colonists will argue specifically against the taxes that there should be no taxation without representation. Now, the British tried to convince the colonists that they actually were represented, that they were virtually represented. That is to say that the members of Parliament, the MPs, were taking into consideration the best interests of the colonies. But of course, this was something that the colonists rejected. They said that they needed a direct representation in Parliament in order to give the taxes and other rules legitimacy. So we have basically a great argument over legitimacy, which is kind of the core of Lockean theory, John Locke, whether governments are acting in a legitimate or illegitimate way, which is to say, do they have the consent of the governed? So we're getting some very interesting things developing very early on. Of course, the controversy over the taxes is really driving the British to believe that they have to kind of enforce what they say as, or what is known as kind of the supremacy of Parliament. It's a real power play. It's a showdown between the colonists and the mother country over who is really in charge. And of course, the British are interested in making the point that the Parliament is in charge and that that should be supreme and recognized by the colonists as supreme. Of course, the colonists disagree, which is why they begin to kind of lawyer up, so to speak. They will adopt things like the Virginia Resolves. They will convene something known as the Stamp Act Congress, and we will see that in places like Boston, where the Sons of Liberty are active, the Stamp Act will be effectively nullified in the sense that there will be a willing uh, uh, action taken by the colonists to refuse to pay the tax, to essentially impose the tax. And so we get basically these non-importation agreements and boycotts by colonial merchants. And of course, it worked. I mean, the thing that is important to realize here is that the colonial resistance against the Stamp Act caused the Stamp Act to be repealed. And what happens is that the British decide that they will get rid of the Stamp Act. That's a very specific tax, but they want to retain the very general principle of parliamentary supremacy, and that will be enshrined in what is known as the Declaratory Act. It is the Declaratory Act that will essentially say that Parliament is supreme, and that perhaps at a later time they could impose taxes that the colonists would be forced to pay. So if anything, it did represent a victory of sorts for the colonists to have the Stamp Act repealed. But the idea that the British were still pushing this idea of parliamentary supremacy, this was, of course, going to just pave the way for a future crisis. And it is a future crisis that will take place, particularly when you have a very important figure, Patriot Sam Adams, rise to the occasion and make the prediction that the British will be back with a new series of taxes that must be resisted by the colonists. Sam Adams was one of the great firebrands of the revolutionary movement. And sure enough, he was right in his prediction. The Townshend duties will be instituted along with other rules such as the Quartering Act, and essentially the British did come back with new rules, new regulations, and new taxes to try and force the colonists to come up with the money to pay for the French and Indian War. It is at this point that we start to get some very interesting documents develop. John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania are actually some of the greatest documents that are penned at this time, because essentially Dickinson is appealing to kind of a constitutional form of resistance. He says that there must be ways to obtain relief from these taxes and to resist the British in a constitutional manner. And of course, this leads to another series of boycotts. And it will be these boycotts that will effectively get the Townshend Acts repealed. And this is another victory of sorts that the colonists will be able to achieve. So they've already gotten the Stamp Act repealed because of their resistance. Now, with Dickinson's Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer and the call for new boycotts, the Townshend Acts will be repealed. However, the issue is still not settled, because the British will retain a tax on tea. It's the one tax from the Townshend Acts that will be left in force. It is intended, just like the Declaratory Act before, to basically show the colonists who's boss, that Parliament does have the right to tax them, and that they do not have a right to representation. So the issue is largely unsettled. Even though the tea tax was a very small thing, what it represented was a very big thing. Of course, you will have a situation where, the colonists will see that, their resistance is making a difference. And you see this resistance in a variety of forms. And in some cases, it becomes quite chaotic, if you will, because when we look at things like the Boston Massacre, which will occur in 1770, the Boston Massacre was precipitated primarily because of the stationing of British troops and the fact that another thing the colonists objected to was the idea that British troops would be stationed kind of patrolling their colonies, particularly in an important port city like Boston. And this leads to a confrontation between kind of out of work colonists that are kind of disgruntled because of that fact alone, and then of course the British soldiers who are not always the cream of the crop. In fact, some of the worst elements of the British Empire or the British Army were sent to the colonies, this part of the empire. And so you have this scuffle take place that eventually leads to what is known as the Boston Massacre. And the Boston Massacre is quite shocking because for the first time, you will have colonial resistance meet with British imperial force, and folks are killed, including the first patriot to die in the cause of liberty, an African American no less, Crispus Attucks. Well, it is after the Boston Massacre that people, kind of reeling from the shock, things will actually settle down. I mean, the Townshend duties had been largely uh, repealed. Colonial resistance had been effective. People were shocked and kind of horrified by what had happened with the Boston Massacre. And so we kind of enter this quiet period as the book describes. All this quiet, however, is going to come to an end when basically support is rallied against the tea tax. The tea tax, remember, had been included in the Townshend Acts and basically left in place after the Townshend Acts were repealed in order to show the colonists who's boss. Well, it was on the basis of this that the Sons of Liberty and others in Boston decided to stage what was known as the Boston Tea Party, which was an attempt to essentially provoke the British by showing them that even the little tax on tea, which incidentally enough was not even a drain on colonial pocketbooks, the tax on tea actually in many cases made the tea cheaper than smuggled tea in from the Dutch East India Company. So it wasn't even about the tax per se. It was about the idea that the British had the right to tax. So we have this event, the Boston Tea Party, and of course it is the Boston Tea Party that provokes the British big time. What they essentially decide is to institute what become known in the colonies as the Coercive Acts, or actually that's what the British call them. The colonists call them the Intolerable Acts. And that is a huge deal because what these acts include are the Boston Port Act, which basically shuts down the port of Boston, a very important colonial port, the government takeover by the British authorities, the takeover of the courts by the British authorities, and a new quartering act where British troops had to be stationed in colonial homes. And this, of course, becomes an absolute overreaction in hindsight by the British to the Boston Tea Party, because what it does is it makes Boston essentially this symbol of, oppression. And this will be the thing that actually draws the other colonies into a kind of alliance with Boston and Massachusetts, because they will see what is happening to Boston and realize that if the British decided they could do that elsewhere, they could do that in Virginia. Remember that Ben Franklin, during the French and Indian War, had tried to bring the colonies together basically for their own defense against the French in what was known as the Albany Plan. It was a complete failure because the colonists were so different and so diverse and so independent that they had no way of really unifying with each other in order to meet even the threat of the French. Now, however, as the British have provoked the colonies by essentially putting Boston on lockdown, you have a situation where the other states or soon to be states, the other colonies, will kind of rush to the defense of Boston, will begin to find common cause. And this will be an extremely important thing because essentially you will see certain groups form, committees of correspondence that will develop as a way to coordinate resistance against British throughout the colonies. And so it is based on these committees of correspondence that you will have boycotts break out throughout the colonies. And then, of course, you will get the introduction of what we call the First Continental Congress, in which this Congress will adopt what is known as the Suffolk Resolves, in which essentially they will petition the British to kind of make right with Boston, to essentially reverse course on putting Boston on lockdown with the Intolerable Acts and coming to some form of compromise with the colonies. The colonies will speak of things well beyond just the boycotts and non-importation. They will talk about plans of union. If you consider Pennsylvania's Joseph Galloway, they'll talk about a colonial Bill of Rights. And essentially, because they are now rather coordinated under this Congress, under these committees, there will be pretty good enforcement throughout the colonies on sticking to this line of thinking. So what the British did in the reaction to Boston and the Boston Tea Party was they essentially caused the colonies to see themselves as a unified group, something that they had never seen before. And this means there's going to be unified resistance against Great Britain. And that is going to be crucial. Of course, the British were having none of it. They were not interested in compromising anymore. After all, the British could credibly make the argument, look, we compromised on the Stamp Act, we compromised on the Townshend Acts, and look where it got us. It just got us more resistance. So now we needed to take a heavy hand. So essentially, you will have, all kinds of measures taken by the British to control the Massachusetts government, to restrain New England with the New England Restraining Act. And of course, you will have George III decide that the only way that he can deal with the situation is to kind of unloose the British military, to put more soldiers into the colonies, and to possibly even take the offensive against the colonies. All of this is happening in the backdrop of colonial organization and coordination. The Second Continental Congress will be convened in 1775, and essentially it becomes the first Congress of the United States. It basically calls for the development of a continental army under George Washington. And even though it sends another petition to the king, the Olive Branch petition, to ask for peace, of course, the king is going to respond with what he calls the Prohibitory Act, which is he's not going to entertain any ideas of peace. He wants the colonies to submit, and that's all there is to it. And so the king decides to take a very hard line, King George III, and of course the colonies by now have made preparations for real resistance by calling for a continental argument. It is into this that we get, the infamous actions that will take place in 1775 when the British try to seize the munitions at Lexington and Concord. And of course, they will be resisted by colonial militias. And after Lexington and Concord, George Washington, at the head of the Continental Army, will rush to the defense of Boston and will battle back the British at Bunker Hill, and will essentially be at war with Great Britain. The United States, what will become the United States, will be at war with Great Britain. And while things did not go very well in 1776, or I should say 1775, there were some real doubts about whether the colonists could maintain resistance, by the beginning of 1776, we have the publication of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which is basically something that will lay the foundations for the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Paine effectively argued that a formal declaration should be made. Responding to all of this will be King George III sending in mercenaries, the dreaded Hessians, German mercenaries, so hiring a foreign army to fight with the British against the colonies. And so the Revolutionary War is underway, the drive to independence is underway, and what we've really seen in the development of this chapter is a series of reactions and overreactions that has driven us to this point. Even Ben Franklin, who was somebody that effectively was always proud of being British, he becomes convinced in the cause of liberty and the cause of independence for the United States, and will back it in 1776, despite the fact that he is dealing with a son who is a loyalist. And it's important to realize that anywhere from a fifth to a third of the colonists were loyalists. The book sticks to the idea that it was about a fifth, but some have put it as high as a third. So there was incredible loyalist sentiment, despite the fact that we had the patriots driving to independence. And of course, it will be independence that will be declared when we get to the middle of 1776. In the summer of 1776, we will see that independence will be formally declared by the colonies, and we will have a declaration that not only does that very act, but also argues on the basis primarily of the theories of John Locke that England had deprived the colonies of their consent, that there was no consent of the governed, and therefore the drive to independence was legitimate, that a government should serve the purpose of allowing the people to pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, this means that we are at war for real, that we have essentially two different countries that are going to be fighting against one another. And it will be a very difficult fight. The colonists will find themselves primarily on the run throughout the Revolutionary War, and attempts to essentially secure New England will be very difficult for the colonists to pull off. There are many setbacks. Washington will lose more battles than he wins, but essentially he keeps his army alive. And this, combined with some rather startling results, including the Battle of Saratoga, where essentially the Americans will defeat the British in their attempt to seal off and contain the problem in New England. This will allow for the French to come in on the side of the Americans, which will be extremely important because the French Navy will eventually make all the difference. So the combination of the British, basically mishandling the war, the colonists, being decisive in their victory at certain points, such as the Battle of Saratoga, the French coming into the war, and then of course the British deciding that they would take the war to the south and try and win it there, will eventually lead to the colonists being victorious along with their French allies. It's important to realize that one of the things that the Revolutionary War does is that it allows for the Americans to make use of a lot of the fighting techniques that they had learned by fighting against the Native Americans, and adopting some new technology, including the Pennsylvania rifle, which allowed for essentially the development of some special forces that would be especially effective on the frontier and of course in the South. Ultimately, the colonists are very good at surviving the war. The British are very bad at believing that the war is a conventional one, and that just the occupation of a few important cities would lead to its end. So the British will occupy New York, they will occupy Philadelphia, but none of this matters because essentially the uh, uh, the British controlling those cities does nothing to destroy Washington's army. Washington is always able to live to fight another day despite adversity at places like Valley Forge and elsewhere. And essentially, it's the survival of that army and the British realizing that they cannot contain the problem in New England that drives the British to the south, where they are further harassed. The British really banked on this idea that the loyalist sentiment was strongest in the south and that they would be able to win the war in the south. But they weren't, primarily because of some of these special forces and frontier fighting that we mentioned earlier. People like Morgan and others. Uh, Morgan, by the way, became known as the Swamp Fox because he was essentially the founder of kind of this idea of special forces in America. They will harass the British Army in the South, and then eventually the French and Washington will be able to coordinate their action in the culminating battle, the Battle of Yorktown, which allows for basically the surrender of the British in North America. Cornwallis will have his entire army surrender to the Americans, and it was so surprising that the Americans played the tune "The World is Turned Upside Down" when Cornwallis surrendered, because it was such a amazing thing in 1781 that this victory could be had. Now, the British could have continued the war, but by this time, you're going to have the British Parliament, arguing that the war is a waste of resources and blood and treasure, and that it would be best simply to let the colonies go. So, if we think about how the Revolutionary War was won, I would have you consider one, the fact that the British were very ineffective. They fought the totally wrong kind of war. They thought that occupying major cities would win the war. They were unsuccessful in sealing off New England from the rest of the colonies. They totally miscalculated in believing that their drive to the south would lead to a loyalist uprising and victory for them. Um, they, of course, because of their blunders, had terrible defeats at places like Saratoga, where the French took a look at the situation and realized that the Americans could win, and so they decided to back them. Other countries backed too. The Dutch supplied a lot of money. All of this essentially led to the disaster at Yorktown for the British, and the Parliament turning against the war because they essentially believed that the British didn't know what they were doing. And when you look at the situation, given the mismatch between the British Army, the strongest army in the world, and the colonists, arguably one of the weakest armies in the world, you do have to wonder, how did the British lose this thing? But they did. And of course, people in Parliament blamed it on incompetence. They blamed it on generals that were more interested in their own reputation. And of course, George III got a lot of blame for his prosecution of the war. And let us not forget that George III was never truly able to recover from his loss of the colonies, of his colonies, as he liked to say. And King George III will eventually go stark raving mad in the latter part of his life, and it's actually quite sad, but he becomes completely insane. And some say that the loss of America was certainly one of the precipitating factors. Either way, the Americans showed that they were highly innovative, not only in the drive to independence, but during the war itself, constantly embracing some new ideas and technology, basically taking calculated risks along the way, and this included even the aftermath of the war. The French had come in and essentially bailed us out, and allowed us to win the Revolutionary War in the way that we did. And we were supposed to negotiate a peace treaty with the French and the British. I mean, everybody was supposed to sit down in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 and effectively allow for a roundtable discussion in which essentially the British and the French would work out the details, and the Americans would accept what they got. Well, the Americans decided, and these were Americans led by John Adams, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin. They decided that they would ignore the French and pursue a separate peace with the British, which meant that in some ways they had kind of cut their ties with the French, which was not a very nice thing to do given how important the French were to the Revolutionary War. Nonetheless, they were highly successful because they were able to get a peace treaty that gave us all the territory to the Mississippi River. And so one way to think about this chapter is just to consider the ingenuity and the innovation of the Americans in not only their drive to independence, but the Revolutionary War and the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, the Treaty of Paris, which was quite generous. If we were to think about the British, it's important to realize that the British, by losing America, actually stood to gain in some ways because it really was a drain of resources. America was, and they never really could get the Americans to pay their taxes or to obey the navigation laws or to play ball in any real commercial sense. And so it was probably a benefit to the British to lose America because they were able to refocus their attention on their global empire, an empire that they wished to rule through the sea. And this, of course, will allow them to be much more successful in a place like India and elsewhere than they ever were in the Americas. They also learned some powerful lessons, which was it's probably best not to deprive imperial subjects of any say in the government. And so what we'll see later on with the British Empire is that they will kind of learn from their American lesson when it comes to some of the home rule that we'll see in places like Australia. So it is rather fascinating, even from a British perspective, the American War of Independence. But of course, we're primarily interested in it because we finally have a country. At long last, after 5 chapters of reading, which amounts to about 200 pages, we now have a United States of America. And the question will become, how does this country deal with its cherished notions of freedom and democracy? What kind of republic will America find itself creating? And will it be a republic that reflects that experiment in freedom and democracy, that belief in the ideas of freedom and democracy? And that's what we'll take up next when we consider how constitutions at the state level provided the model for constitutions at the federal level. Thank you very much. Have a good day.